So the first SMO talent principle that Lawler and Worley discuss is this notion of using competencies to drive talent management. And they say you need to identify the competencies that are needed, determine how prevalent those competencies need to be, and in what combinations. And then they have an interesting conversation about person descriptions. And I guess the question I would have for you is, how does this process really yield something that's substantively different than what we might typically think of as job descriptions, especially if you imagine job descriptions not being some immutable, never changing sort of written document that, goes into your personnel file and that's it. That's what you do, like forever. But instead, if you saw them as something that on a routine basis were revisited, and revisited not only in the context of an individual person and that individual person's performance evaluation, but rather in the context of the greater, what are we trying to accomplish in terms of our mission? Okay. What kind of skills and competencies do we need to accomplish our mission? Okay. How much do we need? And again, in what combination? Does this sound familiar? It sounds like what I just said. Well, again, I would just ask you to ponder, how is what they're describing different than what we might call contemporary ways to deal with job descriptions? The second principle is to use targeted talent management. And here the authors argue that you need to treat people differently based on whether their work and their performance is variable in outcome and pivotal to the organization's success. And I quote, "When a work situation is identified as critical to the organization's performance, there can be no slack with respect to tolerating poor performance and filling jobs." And that's from page 236. Can you imagine a situation in which it would be considered from an organizational standpoint, in any sort of general way, okay to tolerate poor performance? I mean, aren't we always hoping for at least performance at the acceptable level? Not at the superstar level, but isn't it a reasonable thing to expect that it will be at least at the acceptable level? It's hard for me to imagine anything else. I mean, if below standard, below acceptable is acceptable, then either why do we have those positions, or why are we okay with substandard? I just can't wrap my head around this. So it seems to me that we do need to sort of continually upgrade and make sure that people are able to achieve at the levels of performance that are necessary in order for the organization to be a success. The third principle is to use contract labor. And Lawler and Worley argue that you should buy rather than build. And this is basically in line with a more macro organization theory that talks about vertical integration. So when you think about vertical integration in a macro sense, we're talking about a supply chain. And you can vertically integrate going all the way back to the raw material extraction, all the way forward in the supply chain to the end consumer. In fact, you could loop it around with waste and so on. That is, if you owned all of that, if an organization owns from extraction to distribution and even waste, then we describe them as fully vertically integrated. More typically, organizations will choose some parts along that supply chain and they'll decide to specialize in those parts. They'll say, those are our core competences. And then everything else, for all intents and purposes, we do contract it out. We let someone else do the extraction. We let someone else do the distribution. We let someone else do the marketing. I mean, those are all examples of contracting or outsourcing, depending on how you want to look at it. Contract labor is really, sort of the temporary stuff. We bring somebody in and we have them do it for a while, but we don't keep them. They're not a regular part of the workforce. And Lawler and Worley, I think, argue correctly that when you're talking about something that is a core competence, so for example, for Apple, a core competence is product design. That's something that they're not going to want to hire contract or temporary laborers for. That's something that they want to make sure they're investing in. Whereas they might, at the same time, decide that marketing is not something that they want to make sure that is a regular part of their workforce, or not. Okay. Again, a lot of it has to do with how does the organization decide that it wants to allocate its most precious dollars. Closely related to this is the idea of outsourcing. So the first is basically hiring people on a project basis or temporary or seasonal, or I mean, all those things fit. Outsourcing is we say, okay, we're just not going to do this activity at all. So some other organization is going to take that on. It could be something, for example, like payroll processing. It's become pretty common for organizations to outsource this. Most small organizations outsource their marketing. They outsource their accounting function. They'll often outsource their IT function. So those are things that are they're not the particular expertise of the organization, and maybe there isn't even enough work for the organization to have full-time people who are skilled in that area, and so they outsource it. There's nothing new here. I think, again, when you read this information, when you read the summaries, when you think about it, you need to think about it in the context of the whole package. In other words, any one of these things you may well have seen in an organization in which you've worked or one that you've observed. But Lawler and Worley are really trying to say you got to look at the whole package. And when you do that, all together, that's what enables this organization to be sustainably managed. 5 is career diversity. So here they're talking about allowing for basically different tracks, different career tracks, which this is really interesting in the context of the travel light idea. So we're going to give people different ways to be successful, but at the same time, we don't want them to get too attached to us, and we don't want to get too attached to them. It's sort of intriguing. So they argue, that you should allow for sabbaticals, time away for people to sort of re-energize themselves. Give them the option of working part-time for some stretch. Give them family leave, and not just the stuff that, might be federally mandated, but in addition to that, allow people to do job sharing where it makes sense. And they're saying, okay, you should have a variety of these career tracks. And some examples, the one that's for upwardly mobile executives, one for technical specialists. I mean, they go on. But the thing that I want you to think about is what happens if you're on one track and you decide you would now like to be on another track? How doable is that going to be? Is there a way to make that easy for people to switch among tracks? I'm reminded of when I was in high school and people always talked about you were slotted into, you're the college prep track or you're not the college prep track. And so there was the math for people who, hey, they're going to keep going with their education, and then the other math. And once you got going down one track, for example, the other math, you could never get back to the college prep track. Okay, what happens if somebody is a junior in high school, to stick with that analogy, and all of a sudden their brain matures to the point where math is a little bit more straightforward and they've decided they do want to go to college? Too bad. So sad. Imagine your whole life being that way, or at least the part of your life that you dedicate to this particular SMO, if in fact you get stuck in these tracks. The other piece, of course, is somebody's got to manage all of this from an equity standpoint. How do we make sure that even with all of these tracks, we're still managing to get all the work done that needs to get done in order for us to serve our customers? This is challenging. It's always challenging trying to manage work arrangements in an equitable way. Next, number 6 is building a sustainable management brand. So making sure that people understand what they're getting into when they go to work for your organization. Again, I think this is excellent advice regardless of whether we're talking about an SMO or some other kind of organization. I think that the more that you can help people to have manageable, reasonable, most likely, probable expectations of what their work life will be, the better for everybody. The realistic job preview in which you get a sense of what is this organization like before you ever go to work there, so that you can decide, is this really going to be a good fit for me? Am I going to be successful? Am I going to be able to contribute to this organization? I think that's just really smart. And from a psychological contract standpoint, it decreases the probability of misunderstandings and discontent. And in the long run, at least theoretically, I'd still want to see data on this, should yield better retention of people that you want to keep, and it should cause the organization to make fewer hires that ultimately don't work out. On the other hand, you could argue, well, if we're traveling light, we're not getting attached to people. Anyway, I don't want to go off too far on that. But the idea is make sure that it's clear the kind of organization that people can expect when they come to work for you. Number 7 is make career management the individual's responsibility. Okay, so I briefly touched on that in the first video. And in reality, you and I are responsible for our own professional development. We are responsible for managing our own careers. You and I are responsible for deciding what's important to us and what we want to get out of our careers and how that fits into our whole life, how we want to expand our knowledge and skill base. You're all going to graduate school. You're perfect examples of people who've decided to sort of take the bull by the horns and study something that's interesting to you, to be responsible for your own professional development. 8 is making executives the primary talent managers. And with this, I personally would wholeheartedly agree. I think that as long as people report to you, you have an obligation to be invested, involved in their selection, placement, training, etc. It doesn't mean you do all of it, but you should be intimately familiar with what's going on with your people. They are your most important asset. You rise, you sink based upon their efforts, what they bring to the game. So it is to every executive's advantage to, number 1, become quite expert in organizational behavior and everything that entails. This is the micro level stuff. In this class, you're only getting a teaser of organizational behavior. You know, you learn a little bit about the dynamics of individuals and their motivations, but you need to know more. You should be out on the web learning as much as you can about organizational behavior, what makes individual people tick, why and how they work best in teams. You also need to know a lot about organizational theory, which is the more macro level stuff. That's the structure stuff. That's the culture stuff, the organizational politics stuff. You need to become as knowledgeable as possible. There is no way to ever end your learning on these 2 topics, but ultimately they are perhaps the most important ones for anybody who manages people. Instead, what people have a tendency to do is they generalize from themselves. So, I'm motivated by X. Everybody else must be motivated by X. That doesn't work. We also have a tendency to over-exaggerate the importance of the individual traits and underestimate the importance of the structural world on our behavior. And to help illustrate that, I would simply ask you, how do you behave in different settings? Is it always the same, or does it vary as a function of the kind of group in which you find yourself? Is it a social group? Is it a work group? What are the norms in those groups? Does that affect your behavior? I'll bet it does. And that should demonstrate to you the importance of structure, rules, formalization, specialization. All of that impacts how you as an individual choose to behave so that you can be successful. The bottom line for this particular principle is that HR is not the sole function responsible for talent management, but in fact, everybody is. Everybody who has people reporting to him or her, is responsible for talent management. The last principle is a really straightforward one, that HR needs to play a strategic role. It can't just be a staffing function, which in many organizations, that's the role that it's played, where people say out of one side of their mouth that people are our most important asset, and out of the other side of their mouth, they pretty much, we have this function that takes care of it, and it's not my problem. But clearly, if people are what differentiate your organization from other organizations, then this function is, in many cases, the most important. And that brings this chapter to a wrap. Thanks.